imagine if you grew up on the moon, like you would normalize around an entirely different gravity, right? And this different gravity would affect every physical prediction that you would make, right? Around movement and weight and speed and inertia. And then let's say you had to move back to Earth, right? All those predictions would be totally wrong. Like you would get prediction error like crazy. And the gravity on Earth would feel way more oppressive, right? Because all these things would be harder.
Mm.
They would demand more energy. There would be more friction everywhere. And I think like there's potentially an equivalent with digital here, where like if you're a digital native, if you're growing up in digital environments, you're normalizing around something completely different.
Brandon Griggs, thank you very much for joining me, sir. You are the author of the Tech for Life Substack. I've been really enjoying the articles, and as I was saying beforehand, it's great to find somebody that's as interested in this and that's, I suppose, willing to go into these different domains theoretically and trying to pull it together to understand technology, but also, what the technology is doing to us. And so, yeah, I wanted you maybe just to start off just to say a little bit about what you're doing and, why you're working on this project and what it means to you.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, I feel like I found a kindred spirit in the podcast here in terms of its willingness to embrace both of these kind of sides of the question. And that's also kind of my answer, right? And that there's really not enough people that are engaging with technology and willing to kind of push it into the bigger questions, right? Like there's certainly ethics of technology, but a lot of the discourse around both ethics and technology in general, it just feels very low dimensional to me. Either these false binaries of techno-optimism and techno-pessimism, or AI ethics is just limited to, bias and representation or losing our jobs, or it's going the other direction, right? Which is like, oh, the end of the world, in this kind of end. And kind of really grappling it with a way that is taking these issues seriously. It just felt to me that we need more philosophers, we need more technologists, we need more voices kind of engaging with these big issues. And I think what I'm trying to bring to the table is just honestly a complete amateur's perspective. I'm really leaning into that. So I have no degree, I have no publications, I have no credentials of any kind. But on the other hand, I have no constraints of like tenure or publication or career. So like I feel like I have complete freedom to ask all of the stupid questions and speculate wildly, be incredibly naive. And I feel like that's somewhat rare, so I feel like I have an obligation to make the most of that. And part of my writing was try to get some of these things out there and find the kindred spirit. So here we are.
Oh, yeah, 100%, man. And you can see, because there's a great deal of creativity as well of bringing together different, like not being afraid to go into like different areas that are kind of, wouldn't necessarily be in somebody's wheelhouse. Like I find that in academia, like with publications and stuff like that, it's very like you're expected to kind of fill a niche, whereas this problem isn't a niche specific problem. Like technology is a huge topic. And I wanted to start out, I wanted to kind of explore an idea with you, which is that I've been thinking about it that now we're in a fundamentally different age. Like if you think about it, like you have classical antiquity, you have the Middle Ages, you have the modern age, and then with this invention of the internet and the digital world and the coming AI, that we're in a kind of qualitatively different thing now. Like that our environment is entirely man-made in some sense in the digital world, which has just never been the case before. And that's become more significant. I wonder, do you agree with that? Do you think it's too much, or is that something you've been thinking about yourself?
I absolutely agree with it. I think the kind of common criticism that most people would throw back at you immediately would be, well, every generation thinks this way, right? So like you have to make the case. And I think one of the ways where this becomes obvious to me is, so some people that engage with ethics of technology, they want to go backwards. They want to go back to antiquity. They want to go back to the Greeks. They want to go back to classical philosophy and see if there is some wisdom there that can be gleaned that we have lost. And that will be what can guide us. That will be what can define this right relation between humanity and nature and technology that can give us the affordances to judge and guide technology. Like that's the missing piece. And I just think that's wildly insufficient for the reasons that you just described. When Aristotle was laying out and considering his virtue ethics, the scope and scale of human agency was contrived often to just interactions between subjects, between individuals, and confined within the city-state. Like these were
Mhm.
essentially the scale and scope of responsibility that those ethics were dealing with. And now, given the agency that technology has afforded us, which if you throw it into this notion of the Anthropocene, this notion of obviously climate change and these types of things, like we have the agency, the potency of a geophysical force. It's this notion of the global has now become planetary. Like we are, this is the agency we have, whether we want it or not, whether we plan for it or not. Like this is what technology has created. And so the scope of the ethical concern is now dramatically higher. And it's not just kind of like affecting ethics in terms of how we're interacting on an individual to individual basis, but how we're acting as a collective in ways that we've never had to confront before. So I think it's kind of it's adding dimensionality to ethics at every scale. And of course, like to your point around the digital, this is just an entirely new mode of being that we have never confronted before. It's a technology that's essentially merging the medium with our attention. And it's something that, in a lot of ways, historically, is the completion of these projects that go back to at least the Enlightenment of this desire for pure control and pure autonomy, right? So I want to be
Mhm.
a self-authoring being. I want to be fully liberated from anything that is going to get in the way of me implementing my desires in their purest form. And digital, in many ways, is precisely that. So yes, I
Does
agree.
it removes the constraints of space and time, and I've been really enjoying that digital formation book actually, and Anton Barber
Yes,
that you
a web of our
recommended,
own
which
making.
is
It's great.
just genius, man. Really brilliant, kind of like a modern McLuhan. And yeah, that just we've created this digital world almost accidentally, and it's become such a I would say since the pandemic really that it's leaped over the physical, like that the social, the economic, the political is being filtered through the algorithms, through like not just on social media platforms, but I suppose even the structure of just how we've built the architecture of this kind of Barbara describes it as like half video game, half television kind of thing,
Hmm.
mixed with the car. It's kind of like a meta invention. Um, but just how that's been done accidentally in some sense. And that now there needs to be this second generation of like adding constraints to it. Because you've made the point of like it was designed to remove all constraints. But I think that's where a lot of the problems come in is that you take away the constraints and it turns out things like, you know, us functioning well or even just our basic sanity requires some kind of constraints. But what those constraints are and how they're going to look is kind of, I think, what the ethics is really grappling with. Like, is it going to be a classical version? Is it going to be something, you know, does it need to be something new? I know Hans Jonas deals with that, but I wonder, does that sit well with you in terms of like that it's been built in one way accidentally, and now there's this kind of discussion about what the constraints should be after the fact, or like a remodeling.
Right. I think that is what uh, makes technology extremely difficult both to analyze and to kind of apply normative values to. This sense of it's accidental, right? Because the way that technology is adopted into society, it's never what was originally planned. And you can talk to almost any inventor, anyone that kind of initially came up with some technology, and then compare that to what it actually ended up with in terms of its full adoption into, our socioeconomic dimensions. And that's never the same, and it's always evolving. It's always changing. Like every new technology that's injected into an environment is going to change all the other technologies that are a part of that environment. And so it always feels kind of accidental. And it's always one of those where it's also every technology was invented for some reason of a very positive aspiration, right? And it's often sold that way. And that's how it's sold to the public to get it. But then, of course, like capitalism and greed and fear and all these things kind of play in, and those kind of take their toll. And again, the end result is always something much less than whatever those initial positive aspirations were for the technology. So that's kind of one part of it. And I think the digital side of it as well kind of makes that even more opaque because every time we're engaging with digital, it never feels momentous. It never feels like we're kind of impacting our future. It always feels like we're just doing something like in the moment, right? It's just like these kind of like this episodic sequence of just like minor moments, and we can always choose. We can always choose to end if we want. Like we're always making that active decision. It's always utterly responsive to our desire. So it never feels like we're making these decisions. So it kind of, that's how it feels accidental, right? So I think like that's absolutely true. And that kind of makes it difficult to be like, whoa, 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 all right, we need to recognize that this isn't just accidental, that all of these kind of like little sequential events and momentum is building up to something that now is consequential. And so A, we have to understand that. And then B, once with that understanding, we have to understand, yes, what are these constraints? What do we actually want from this? And so I, I'm very big in following Heidegger a little bit here, where like when he wrote his book on technology, he said, okay, why are we trying to understand technology so we can have a free relationship to it, right? So I think a lot of people, particularly in digital ethics, they kind of jump to making normative claims, right? That this is less real, that it's worse than, that there's some pathology here. Let's characterize it as addiction. And I think there could be truth to a lot of those things. But I think before we jump to making a lot of those normative claims, we have to be really careful that first we're understanding it. And why do we want to understand it? So we can have a free relationship to it. And freedom has this kind of interesting dichotomy between constraint. If you have no constraint, if you have pure choice, then freedom, this notion of absolute freedom, which is kind of a common philosophical subject, it's going to be paralyzing. It's actually not possible without constraint. So I think to both of your points, yes, it does feel accidental. That adds to the challenge of both understanding it and add normative conversations around it. And yes, we do need to start understanding what are the constraints that are going to enable us to have a free relationship to digital, first in understanding, so that we can then start to make normative claims.
Okay, nice. Yeah, and that our understanding, because I guess maybe it might be worth separate. Obviously, my focus is very much on digital technology. I know you think you're focused on technology is a broader thing than that. So, I mean, would you make a separation between digital technology and other? Because I guess on some level, I mean, the invention of the car obviously reshapes, roads. It reshapes where people live, and I think there is a continuum with that in the internet in terms of how it's going to reshape, in terms of constraints. It's like when you invent a car, you have to invent seatbelts, you have to invent stop signs, you have to invent roundabouts, you have to invent uh, all of these other things that come as a consequence of that. And for me, I see the internet as being like the invention of the car, but we haven't got all the other stuff yet. Like we haven't figured out how to do that. And one of the obstacles obviously is that it's on a planetary scale. So you made the point that we have to understand, first of all, what our relationship is with technology and understand ourselves, I suppose, how it's shaping us and what we are and how we function, which in a planetary level, like beyond cultures and in our very relativistic cultures, is quite a difficult thing to do as well. So, sorry, that's a lot, but do you think that's a fair thing, that we're at that point in the digital, like the car, and that it's going to require some kind of universal ethics pretty much to address it because of the type of invention it is?
Ooh. Well, I think we're seeing the digital kind of like so much of what the digital is trying to do is it's compelling us to reinterpret everything in our non-digital world on digital terms. Right? So we're going to continue to see more and more of the digital encroaching into the non-digital, which of course we're seeing with self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles, right? So in a sense, it's almost like to compare it to cars is a less useful analogy because it's becoming cars, right? And I also
Yeah,
think it's a
it's
little
more important.
right, and it's a little difficult because like cars is such a the the demands on what constitutes the good in a car is quite simple. It's pretty easy to kind of like translate like this is what a good interaction with a car is in ways that are going to be legible to constraints and legible to norms that are just not in the digital, right? And this is the other way that the digital it becomes so important to understand it because right now, without kind of constraints, and not even constraints, but just norms and understanding, the only way that you can have a right relationship with technology now is this kind of like this individual virtue, right? Like it's up to you to understand this so that you can understand the attention dynamics, so that you can put in whatever in your life is necessary. And ultimately, it's like it's asking everyone to be a philosopher, a neuroscientist, a evolutionary game dynamic theoretic game dynamic expert, all these types of things. because it's so open-ended and because there is such little friction between what we're using the medium for and our attention and our desire. And the compulsion of digital is to remove friction. It's to remove all these things, right? So it's totally open-ended. There's no kind of just looking at digital, here's a right way. Now sometimes things become so obvious that we start to see equilibriums form. And I think we're seeing that a little bit, at least here in the US, I think in the UK as well, with starting to take seriously the idea of like banning phones in school, right? That we've seen enough evidence here that asking children to mediate the entirety of their social formation through an app, through likes and these types of things, like this is not healthy, not productive. All the science that we're seeing, this is leading to atomization and loneliness and anxiety and increased suicide, et cetera, et cetera. And perhaps those are overblown. Perhaps you can argue with some of that data, but I think it also just intuitively makes sense that just children kind of figuring out society through a phone, just this isn't going to work.
You'd be surprised, man. I was actually at a conference today, Weapons of Mass Distraction, that was part of European Research Council. I don't know the exact name of the project. It was in Denmark, but they had, one of the debates was, is social media harming youth mental health? And they had the for and against, and just like the statistical analysis, like one group of statistics says it is, the other group says entirely no, correlation versus causation, like such an incredible split. And then they had another set of talks about digital technology harming attention spans or attention capacities, and on that it was much more conclusive in terms of like, oh, there's these problems. And it just seems like it split the audience, because I think it's hitting, the problem with it is it's those enlightenment ideas and like the meta crisis, and it's hitting a lot of these gaps between like mind and body and how we think about the mind and how we think about, because mental health is a very fuzzy category in some sense. Like your point about the car was like, yeah, okay, we understand how a car works. It's meant to take us from A to B, but what is the point of a digital platform? Is it meant to take us like A to B in terms of our like personal transformation? Like, is it, what's the point of these kind of more abstract things? And really within the scientific community, there's a big split in terms of how, like, whatever premises you start from, really, you're going to end up in a different thinking about what's good digital tech and what isn't. I think you're right that it is moving in that direction, but I think part of the slowness is this like confusion about the mind and about the norms really of human kind of mental functioning. I don't know, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, in all sorts of ways. I mean, it gets to the point of like this notion of wisdom. What would it be to use digital wisely, right? And again, if we go back to Aristotle, like he kind of saw that in two ways: either moral habituation, where you're just constantly by habit kind of doing the right thing, even if you don't realize it's the right thing. If you do enough of that, it starts to become second nature to you in essence. And the second component would be this notion of moral exemplars, right? These kind of like elder figures or other people that have this reputation of always acting wisely, and being able to look up to them and essentially ask, well, what would this person do in this situation? There's someone that acts wisely. And who are the moral exemplars of living a good digital life, right? And this is where there's this gap between, this generation, this digital native generation, and the ones that came before. Because there's just nothing that the previous generation can really offer in terms of, this is how you navigate puberty on an app, right? This is how you navigate your first crush, these first feelings, all these social dynamics. Like, we just threw them to the wolves, right? So like, of course, this is going to be a disaster. Now, I don't necessarily think that means like digital itself is a disaster, right? And I think this is where I want to stake the claim is like, no, we have to understand this first, right? We have to understand like there are benefits of engaging in a digital society, like the fact that you can greatly expand who you can share interests with and who you can be exposed to, and your ability to develop empathy, right? Just by virtue of the ways of being that you are exposed to beyond just your local social searches. Like we could go on and on, right? Of different ways, but the education has to be like, okay, children, right? Like this is what digital can afford, but this is where it can go wrong. And it's going to be up to each of you to kind of figure out what this right balance is. And ideally, it's here are people that are doing this well, and here's why they're doing this, and here's why we think it's well. right? And then here's some of the science too behind why this can, like, this actually changes your brain. Like, this will change your brain. Like, this, I'm sure you're like, I'd like to hear you speak on that more than me. But like, this gets
Yeah,
into
you're
the
welcome.
understanding part of it, right? In terms of like how we need to start embracing this. It can't just be like, oh, this is bad. No digital, no phones. This is just, we're just going to make blanket normative claims. Like, we have to understand it first.
I 100% agree. That's so well put. And the issue of like this just being kind of dropped into a generation, I was obviously born a little bit before it, so I remember pre-internet time. But like, I think it's in that Barbara Kay book. He describes that there's never been a bigger generational gap before than the digital natives and their parents or their grandparents in terms of living in like different worlds, like different value systems, different norms, different challenges, and no response really to prepare people for that, like no way of setting up these kind of, even I don't know, communities of moral exemplars. Like I don't even know anybody who, I mean, I study digital technology and my digital relationship to digital technology probably isn't great. Like I definitely use like apps more than I would like to be doing, like on. So you know there's a real there's a disconnect there, I think, between understanding that things are going wrong and then applying it into norms that can be kind of socially distributed. I know Jonathan Haidt obviously is putting a lot of work into that in terms of like the phone free childhood, and that kind of stuff. But interestingly, in that conference, the weapons of mass distraction one of the biggest arguments that was made really is the moral panic argument, which is that the digital world, the digital problems is just a moral panic. It's the same as when video games came out and people say, oh, they cause violence, or television comes out and you say, oh, people are going to be stuck to the screen 10 hours a day and they're going to get stupid or something like that. So they kind of assume that this is a continuous, I suppose, the same track as other technologies, like from the newspaper to the radio to the television to this thing. But I think the digital technology is a different type of transformation than that. I do think your point is that we need to adapt, communities, we need to adapt moral exemplars in ways that you probably didn't need to for newspapers or television. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but
Yeah, I mean, first, I personally would dismiss the moral panic argument as being almost utterly spurious, right? Like, because like it's one thing to say that a moral panic is happening. It's another thing to say that the moral panic is correlated with some kind of it's inversely proportionate to the actual cause harm. Like, oh, every technology has moral panic. Great, that doesn't mean that it's not justified, right?
yeah.
And some of that panic might be more or less justified. So it really doesn't matter. We still have to understand why it may or may not be justified. That's the important part, right? Like, to kind of use panic as a proxy to just then make that judgment, to me, seems just kind of like a waste of time.
Yeah, I was really shocked how many times it came up, to be honest, because I thought it was a very weak argument, really, to be making, and especially considering the mounting evidence and obviously the longitudinal studies on like mental health crises among teens. And even I always wonder, because I suppose this is again what we're talking about with constraints, is like how can we understand like the positive aspects of the platforms, the negative aspects of the platforms. Like we need to kind of have this understanding. I know you, because we've been talking about active inference, obviously in terms of dimensionality, our models' ability to reduce uncertainty. It seems like we need some sort of framework like that just to begin parsing out, the good bits from the bad bits, and then you can kind of articulate to people how to act with the platforms. But I'm not even sure we're there yet, really.
Right. And again, there I would caution against kind of preemptively labeling it the good bits or the bad bits, right? Like, we just need to
Mhm.
understand the bits, right? Like, before we can even
Sure.
label one good or bad, we have to label them, or we have to understand precisely what's going on. And I think,
Mhm.
like, for me, that's kind of what led me to kind of trying to explore this idea of active inference uh, with with digital. And it's hard to explain without getting into exactly everything that active inference is. But like, I think the best metaphor I can think of is gravity, right? So like, imagine if you grew up on the moon, like, you would normalize around an entirely different gravity, right? And this different gravity would affect every physical prediction that you would make, right, around movement and weight and speed and inertia. And then let's say you had to move back to Earth, right? All those predictions would be totally wrong. Like, you would get prediction error like crazy. And the gravity on Earth would feel way more oppressive, right? Because all these things would be harder.
Mm.
They would demand more energy. There would be more friction everywhere. Your 200-mile golf drive on the moon like would be like 200 yards on Earth. Like, ah, crap. And I think like there's potentially an equivalent with digital here, where like if you're a digital native, if you're growing up in digital environments, you're normalizing around something completely different. But instead of being like a different physical gravity that changes your predictions, like of how Newtonian physics affects forces and weights and such, it's more like a different mental gravity that changes your predictions for how society works, for how rules of active inference kind of affect uncertainty. And in the active inference terms, like this would be like aerodynamics, right? Like the quality of uncertainty we would expect to find in certain situations, and the quantity of that uncertainty that we would consider manageable, right? And so I think like this manifests in terms of when we're in digital, when we're on like the moon, so to speak, like we're kind of used to being able to completely control our environment. We're kind of used to completely control our presentation. Like right now, we're showing video, but I didn't have to show you video. Like right now, like you don't know how tall I am. You don't know what my reputation is. You don't know where I'm from. Like I'm completely controlling what I'm exposing to you. I have control over my presentation. This environment is very self-authored. Now, the fact that it's a dynamic conversation is adding some uncertainty. I might say something incredibly stupid. I probably already have. But like we could have just done an email where I could have controlled it even more, right? So like
Yeah.
it's I can always control my uncertainty in a way that these things are always on my control. Now consider some of the behavior with digital natives that kind of gets parodied a little bit, but like this notion of everyone's afraid to answer the phone, right? Uh, People are even afraid to have food delivered by opening the door. They'd rather just leave it at the door, right? And it's kind of this sense of like, whoa, like, well, if I'm engaging with this person leaving food, like now they're seeing me. They're like, I don't have control of this presentation, of my own self presentation. Like there could be a lot of surprise here. And I haven't developed the muscles. I'm like, this gravity is a lot stronger now. Like there's friction being introduced here. And like, this is kind of an interesting dynamic in terms of like, almost developing this muscle to embrace degrees of uncertainty that we have like the non-digitals have normalized in the non-digital world. But if you're kind of developing this normalization through this moon-like gravity, like once you hit that earth, it's like whoa. And then of course, like if you have no compelling reason to live in that non-digital world with all of that friction, with that strong gravity, why would you? Because everything over here, well, I can control it myself. I have much more certainty. I don't keep running into these prediction errors. So what possible reason would I have? And now I'm going to start reconstructing, recasting, reauthoring my reality along those digital terms, right? That's where I feel most real. That's where I've got all of my social interactions, all of my validation, all of my networks, all of my self-worth. So I think like I kind of got into active inference and trying to explore like what are some of these kind of foundations that could help us start to understand how this isn't just panic, and these types of things, like that there could be something legitimate here, and that this at least starts to point at some possible explanations that could even be possibly empirically verified in a way that can help us understand it, right? And even in all of that, what I just described, like I wasn't making a normative claim. Like I'm just trying to understand why some of this behavior might be occurring and what would be the explanation.
Yeah, and it's a brilliant metaphor, to be honest. The like adapting to a different kind of gravity, and you see that. I was talking about. There was one study in college students were struggling to recognize people's emotions more, and that some of them were having to be taught essentially to recognize emotions because if you spend so much time, like there was in previous generations, you would have had so much time looking at people growing up because there wasn't an alternative. Like if you have a screen basically that can, fill like how many hundreds thousands of social interactions you miss because of over screen time, then what's the opportunity cost there? Is it recognizing people's emotions? Is it being able to face social anxiety, being able to face the resistance of day-to-day life? And then that you become unfit, I suppose, in some sense, or over adapted to be very successful online maybe, but that doesn't translate to offline environments necessarily. And that it creates almost like a two worlds kind of thing going on where it's like the more you overfit to the digital, the less fit you'll be offline. But I think we've made, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but because of the social success and economic rewards that are available online, like if you spend all of your time streaming or like, putting out tweets and stuff, you can get real opportunities from that. It's almost incentivized more than, I don't know, offline methods to social success or status. So it's like almost like young people are being funneled into that overfitting, because of how, I suppose, essential it's become to our, society.
Yeah, I mean, overfitting is a good word, and I think where there's real risk here is the opportunities that no longer might be in your possibility space because you've overfitted
Mhm.
in one world, and the possibility spaces in the other world are now no longer available to you. And I think like if your kind of spectrum of emotional uh, legibility or literacy, I guess, would be a good way to say it, right? Like
Yeah.
that's going to prevent you from kind of really establishing intimate and vulnerable relationships, in the real world. And that likewise is going to prevent you from really getting those transcendent relationships that draw you out, that make you more than what you were because you confronted something other, that pushed back, that pushed you beyond, that questioned you, right? And again, like it's not to say that one is necessarily worse than the other, right? It's a broader spectrum of possibility. And of course, like when you're making yourself vulnerable, you're also making yourself open to more pain, to more finitude, right? And so like it's natural that someone would want to avoid the pain that comes with embracing these things, right? But if they're going to do that, they need to do it with the full understanding that they're also closing off some of those opportunities of the more transcendent aspect of these spectrums. That not
Yeah.
being able to engage these muscles, like you need that harder gravity. Like this type of stuff is only available on the Earth gravity. You're just not going to be able to do these types of things without it. So like, yes, if you're going to be spending all this time in digital, like go for it, but do it with full recognition of exactly what's happening here, right? And I think to your point of like this two worlds, I also like this is where I'm a little hesitant of like, some of these trad memes or cozy cottage, Walden ponding, these kind of like
Yeah.
different kind of like
Factual
notions
first
of
kind of thing.
yeah, like of just like of saying like no, we don't want that other world. We're going back to this world because this world is better than
Yeah.
that world. And I think like especially from an educational perspective, like we're not going back to one world, right? Like it's just like in terms of developing, um, even getting back to what we were talking about with ethics, like we need to can we develop an ethical plasticity by which we can actually navigate between different worlds that have different ethical dynamics, right? Can we navigate between these social environments that have different social dynamics, right? Like
Mhm.
talk about if you think about the communities and relationships that you have in digital versus the communities and relationships that you have in non-digital, these are qualitatively different communities and relationships that are bound to the fact that they are either constructed and created in the non-digital world or the digital world, right? And do we want to say that, oh, I'm pro digital world communities and not an anti non-digital world? Like no, like we need to be able to develop this capacity to navigate between them. And so like we've just taken something that we never really mastered in the non-digital world in terms of like
Yep.
community, and now like we have to play that game on hard mode by like now adding this meta skill of being able to kind of like understand where you are, the environment, and the roles that those demand, and how that's impacting you in
Mhm.
your kind of active inference muscles, right? And be able to understand that and act accordingly. And I think like the danger, again, if we want a free relationship to it, like great, be the streamer, but do that from a perspective of freedom and full understanding of both what you think that you're gaining and what you risk losing, right? And so for
Yeah.
me, that's kind of how I'm trying to think about this.
And yeah, I love that what you're saying about that kind of duality, that there's, because it was something when I spoke to John Vervaeke about this previously, and he made the point that the context of this attention economy that's come about, or the digital world, um, is in the meaning crisis pretty much. He was like, a lot of the cultural institutions that organized our attention and our experience have, come under fire in the West, or people have largely, aren't occupying them as much as they used to be. So we have a kind of, a time between worlds of like what are the norms for people's lives, like what are the expectations for how people should behave, that are very uncertain anyway. And then you add the problem of then having to figure out the norms for an entirely new world, when you already have this kind of existing confusion in the offline world. And so you can see that, like, why, if all norms are as good as any other norms, if we have this kind of relativist perspective, like, why shouldn't digital groups be organized any way that they want to be? And then of course you get things like pedophilia on Reddit, where you get groups of norms of like, there was one guy, I think he went on TV to try and defend it because they were sharing photos of underage girls and they were giving feedback on them based on the mechanics of Reddit. And we're like, in that weird subgroup of that became normalized. And then you go, well, if people are learning these things in those groups and then coming back to the offline world, you're having, I suppose, increasing complexity from the two of them. I don't know, like, do we need the norms for both, or just, are you going to make the digital norms based on the offline norms? Does that work? I don't know. That's a lot to throw at you, but
Yeah, no, the Reddit example is so good because like they're coming to the offline world and like, well, what's the problem? Look at all these likes that I was getting, and look at all this kind of like
well, that's
social
it.
credit
Like,
that I was
it
getting.
was, there was great feedback online
Right,
about it.
exactly.
Why can't I just do this in normal life?
Right, like
Like,
what's the problem? What's the problem here? Um, yeah, yeah, and I think like it's even more than that. Like it's it's yes, these old kind of traditions have both lost their validity in terms of kind of like establishing givens that we can just take for granted that this is how you do things, and
mhm,
we're all operating under the same givens, so we don't have to operate at this level. So part of it is this continuation of just like living in a pluralistic world where everyone is cosmopolitan. No, it's just harder and harder to be centered into kind of these traditional communities that says we don't care about the larger world. Like these are the givens that we're ascribing to, and we're going to operate accordingly. And if you're going to be inside our membrane, we're going to be expecting you to also operate to those and not question them, just to accept them as givens, right? And so, like, it seems very unlikely that we're going back to that world, but also even seems worse than that. It seems like the possibility of that world is no longer even possible, right? Like the possibility of a world to be kind of temporally and theoretically defined as something stable and coherent enough to create a set of norms and cultures that then can persist in a plural, like within a larger pluralist community. Like it'll be interesting to see even how possible that is, and whether our ethics needs to be something that is capable of kind um, of uh, hmm, like transcending this notion of a stable world to begin with. Like it almost needs to embrace that like things aren't going to slow down. Things are only going to accelerate. Like this
mhm,
gap between the grandparents and the children, like that's only going to get worse, right? Like the idea of moral habituation, moral exemplars, is no longer a viable model of kind of
mhm.
like um, uh, taking wisdom and trying to translate that across generations, right? Like that's no longer viable as a means of kind of ethical norms, ethical education.
Yeah,
And so
there's
like
people that
needing to
argue that
think about
that's like the end of, that one. I'm thinking of Zach Stein's work on education at a time between worlds. He's big on the intergenerational knowledge transmission, and that when the intergenerational knowledge transmission breaks down, that's like, the source of civilizational collapse, pretty much. So
right. I'm not saying that it
yeah,
breaks down, but I'm saying it can't be based
mhm.
on do this because this is how we did it. And here's other people that did it like this that you can look up to.
It's a
It needs
novel,
to be
novel
it
problem.
right. It needs to be more abstract than that. It almost needs to be this kind of
Mhm.
like meta ethics. Like this is ultimately what your values are. And you need to be
Yeah.
able to kind of locate these values in novel environments. And you need to find other people that share these values in novel environments. And then you need to figure out how you can live in with integrity to those values in these novel environments, even environments that you've never seen
Yeah.
before, right? So
Mm.
it's like that would be an example, right? And so it's not learning a set of ethics, it's learning a skill by which you can learn ethics, right? And that's how we get better at this intergenerational. It's more a set of practices by which we can live ethically. That doesn't need to be anchored to moral habituation. That doesn't need to depend on having moral exemplars in order to live ethically, right? So I agree with Zach's point that like if we lost that capacity, then yes, that would be the end. But it doesn't mean that that capacity if it looks different than how it traditionally has looked, is necessarily lost.
Yes, and that I suppose that there's opportunities as well for it in a sense that you have in the digital the ability to transmit information, faster across more people to remember more things. I mean, almost like if you could get the principles right,
Mm,
participation in the digital would be the education in some sense. Like, because I mean, I think we outsource a lot of our self control to the environment. Really, everything I've looked at with attentional control is that it's mostly to do with context, even internally, like in active inference, like higher levels of the generative model provide context to the lower levels that help it, deal with whatever is coming up. Like to feel like you're in a familiar environment is contextual, and online that context doesn't track really. And I think for
mm,
some that's an advantage for some platforms, like so on social media platforms, like they're coffee shops, their pubs, their libraries, their talking things, their coliseums, they're all of these things in one. Whereas in offline places we can quite clearly say, okay, I'm in a coffee shop, I know how to behave in a coffee shop. Okay, I'm in a library, I know how to behave in a library. But we don't really have that same thing for digital spaces yet. It's quite like, I mean, we learned certain things about like norms of email. Maybe it's like, okay, somebody emailed me, I have to reply in a certain amount of time and
mm.
stuff. But I think there needs to be this kind of contextual shaping to understand how to control yourself in the environments. Does that land with you?
Yeah, I mean, it does. Have you seen anyone that like, have you seen good examples of this? Have you seen, um, and I guess my question would be like, whew,
Mhm.
short of like, what are the motivations that are going to incentivize these kind of movements into the digital?
Not business incentives anyway, because that that doesn't seem to be aligning at all. Pretty much in terms of self regulation, I think it would have to be, um, well, external regulation. I think you because I don't know if governments can just do a top down. Essentially, I think if people were given more opportunities, so like an example of content ranking algorithms, like if people could decide what principle their content ranking algorithm was going to be curated by. It's like, okay, I want mine to be curated by entertainment today, by learning tomorrow. I want to see funny stuff. I want to see things of people, positive things. I want to see negative things. If people could do that, had a level of control over it, there'd be a kind of competition of ideas for what's the best way to organize this algorithm. And you might have something emerge from that to be like, oh yeah, this is, the best type of algorithm that we have in terms of, people feel good and it's improving their predictive grip or something like that. So I think you could have, but again, that's not in the interest of the companies. So they have a very strict model in terms of a content ranking algorithm, which is for engagement, which is the capturing of moment to moment action selection. So I think there needs to be some intervention to open that up, but then to have a kind of marketplace, because a lot of the platforms have been built and they haven't really been changed by the people that are on them. They're mostly changed by the companies optimizing to make them more addictive, or to capture more attention, really. So I think if people had more influence over that, we could have some competition for norms that would win out, or for even platform structure.
Yeah, I mean, two things I'll respond to there that you were discussing. I think one is this. I wrote an essay called "A Constraint Theory of Technology," and in it I was kind of like positing, well, like how would this, if we actually took this seriously, what would be one of the things that we would see? And one of my points was empowering an individual right of constraint. And that's kind of like what you were talking about in terms of like, controlling the algorithm. And it could be a principle. It could be, wow, that Hmong guy, like he seems like he's wise, right? So like I want his algorithm, like whatever. Like
Yeah.
I don't have the capacity to do this or the time, but I definitely understand the importance of it. So like let me just like I'm just going to
Yeah.
co-opt his in trust. I'm going to put my trust in him. Or likewise, like these are,
Yeah.
these are the statistics that these different algorithms, and this one leads to this. Like, actually start testing this, right? Like this
Yeah.
leads to these outcomes, and then oh,
Yeah.
cool, I want that one then. So I think that is massively underexplored. But I will push back a little bit on, not business incentives, right? Because
Mhm.
like, do you think businesses want students, or do you think businesses want phones to be banned from schools?
No, I don't think so. And I think there's a good point there as well in terms of like if the companies were competing on different metrics, that's one thing in the literature that comes up. Like if you had health and safety metrics or things like that, like a wisdom metric or an autonomy metric, that companies are like, okay, well, if you participate in our thing, you'll get these other gains. At the moment, the way it's set up, it's just competition for attention. So like TikTok go short form video, so Instagram Reels start doing it, and then YouTube Shorts have to do it. So they're competing on that short term attention capture. But if you had metrics for other things, they could compete on those metrics, and then you might get the business interests kind of working the other way. So that would be one suggestion. But
Right, but I don't think the metrics necessarily buy you anything unless the metrics are actually influencing adoption, actually unless they're legible to profit, right? Like the only metric that matters is profit. And that's not necessarily a
yeah,
bad thing. Like profit is quite useful in compressing a whole bunch of social good into a single metric, by which, like historically, when the stakes are of a certain threshold, it's been able to kind of like translate that into social good. Like businesses aren't going to create products that kill people. Like they're not going to kill their customers. That's self-defeating, right? And like you can kind of elaborate, extrapolate from there to all sorts of kind of social positives that like the profit motive can lead to. And so, like my larger point around like businesses wanting to be in phones, like they're essentially killing their customer. Like if you make it so addictive that it becomes obvious that it's addictive, and it becomes obvious that those addictions are leading to social maladaptive practices in a way that is not just correlative, but causative to the platforms themselves, like that is hitting the profit motive, right? So it's not necessarily about different metrics. It's more about compressing what we want into the price metric so that it is then legible to the companies, and like doing a phone ban because it's become obvious that these things are actually provably harmful to children. Like
yeah,
there's some potential that that's going to hit them. And if some other company came out and said like, yes, our profit motive is incorporating this and we're doing it in this kind of provable way, now that
yeah,
opens up disruption, right? And it's
yeah,
it's not necessarily metric driven. I definitely grant your point that these things, like part of the work of those metrics is to make it legible to the profit motive, so that
mhm.
like these other kind of like things that are good about capitalism can actually be put in service of these other things that are now being made legible to that profit motive.
Yes, I totally agree. I think the incentives, if you could get the incentives working properly, like it would, it could be improved that way. I think part of the problem is that there's zero price markets for these technologies at the moment. I mean, Jaron Lanier talks about that, where you had this kind of mixture of like extreme capitalism and extreme socialism in Silicon Valley, and they want to give everything away for free, but they need to make loads of money. So, they gave away the platforms for free, but they make money from the advertisers on the back end.
Mhm.
And there's some movement towards subscription models, but as long as that's the model, in some sense, their hands are kind of tied because they have to capture more attention to make money from the advertisers, and then that incentivizes the bad behavior. So if you had a different kind of business model, um, yeah, I think that could work. At the moment, the way they're set up, and because of network effects, the biggest companies have the most people, and so people can't transfer between them very easily. So there's a kind of
Right.
stasis where it's like, because the platforms themselves aren't that complicated. I mean, they don't make money on their software, they make money on their popularity, like on everybody being there and being reachable. So we're at a weird kind of stasis in terms of that, where they're quite, very competitive with each other and rigid because of the business model. But I think you could have something better. Like I no, and you could innovate and make a better platform and then market it to be like, this is better than those ones, and you could get more people and kind of establish a new model. I would 100% agree with that. It's just not really happening at the moment, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm similar. Like I'm a little bit reactive against people that kind of make blanket statements that capitalism is the root of all evil here, and that, like if somehow
Yeah,
we
no,
just had
I'm a
different.
big fan of capitalism. To be honest, I actually think this is not capitalistic because what they're doing is like hacking human. It's not very free market.
Right,
Like it's like it's manipulative in a sense. Like
right.
addictive goods don't behave like normal goods, so they're an exception really to the functioning of the market. Um,
Exactly, and I think I'm also a big proponent of common goods, in the
mhm,
commons, and I think a digital commons and kind of establishing that would be phenomenal. Where like
yeah,
you let capitalism kind of compete on metrics by which these uh, dynamics are kind of like sequestered, quarantined, right? And so
mhm,
you render unto Moloch that which is Moloch, but you just don't let Moloch even play with some of these things that we've kind of sequestered to the commons and said, no, you can't touch these. So I think there's like a lot of interest. Like I think the
mm,
the, the place to kind of like redeem capitalism is underexplored. And like before we just
Yeah.
throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think like we could play with that bathwater quite a bit. Or is it baby? I don't know.
Yes.
But there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot we could play. There's a lot we could play with
No,
there.
keep the bathwater and the baby. I don't know,
Yeah.
but yeah, because they and you're totally right. Because I think the full state solution, like what China does, like in terms of controlling, like just having the informational space completely controlled by the government, is a terrible idea. Like it's really not going to be. I don't think any government with that level of power is going to use it. You know, responsibly. Really, it's too much. So yeah, this kind of semi needing to keep the private, but then the companies haven't been, great. But it's almost like if you could just get like the proper principles and automated. I know that was the idea with like a lot of the Web3 stuff and the blockchain of setting it up so it was like nobody was in control, but it's decentralized. But obviously that requires like a lot of skill for people to use it, that the vast majority of people just don't have to be onboarded to. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to realize like we are uh what 16 years into the digital age proper. Like that is nothing. That like the amount of time that that represents for trial and error to work its magic, like that is nothing, right? And I think like now we're seeing the need for like much more trial and error. But when you
Mhm.
look at historically, when kind of transformative technologies have entered the scene, you notice two things. One, like the periods of the most kind of chaos and human violence has always accompanied these moments of technological transition, whether it's agriculture, whether it's the printing press, like it industrialized bureaucracies with world, like you can, it's easy to draw these convergences. But the other thing is like it takes time. It takes time to figure this out. Like humans are exceptionally good at finding the equilibrium, but we need to have the capacity to run these trials and errors, right? Like this is what we do. This is kind of like the magic of even of active inference, right? Is like you learn from experience to update your generative models. Like, and we need the breathing room to do that. And we need to do it in ways that like we just don't sacrifice an entire generation to like, hey, you guys figure this out. We're gonna let you guys run the experiment. Oh crap, that didn't quite work out, but sorry. Like now we'll try to find the equilibrium. Now we'll try to like course correct. So like the more infrastructure that we can build in, if we think of public infrastructure, like public infrastructure for the digital, in my opinion, should be the things that allow us to run these types of experiments at scale at agencies that previously just weren't really required. Sometimes they were. Sometimes we just dumped a bunch of lead into the environment, and it lowered the IQ of generations, or we just dumped a bunch of ozone into the atmosphere. But like for the most part, the scale of these new technologies are going to demand like we're not going to plan this. We're not going to perfectly plan the social adoption of any of this. The only thing that we've ever proven to actually like make progress and what we're exceptionally good at is trial and error. So what is the version of trial and error for digital? What is the version for technologies of that scale? I think is a massively underexplored question. And that's where like if you think about public infrastructure that can enable like these types of trial and errors, I think is kind of a whole opportunity space that like would warrant college departments everywhere because like that's how important this is going to be.
Yeah, 100%. And based on like even learning from what they've done so far in terms of having access to like, Facebook's data, Instagram data for researchers, because I mean, they're psychographic measurement metastructures, as Zach Stein was fond of saying, like that they've pretty much mapped out the entire of, billions of people's personalities. Like there's so, they've they've really cooked up something there that could be very useful to understand ourselves if it wasn't just being used for kind of you know selling ads. And so I mean I don't know if you ever watched that. It reminds me of Zach. He's talking about planetary scale computation, this idea that we've made this kind of digital world that's planetary, that connects all of these things. It's not rooted in something specific, and that it's in that sense, it's once you put AI on it and you start giving it almost like an agency to interact with us, you end up with this kind of unified, like super being, super kind of essential. I don't know, centralization, like planet wide centralization of intelligence or some kind of higher thing. And he thinks that this is where this is going, really, that a lot of this early digital stuff that was accidentally made is a kind of front loader for this longer term. Like this isn't going to be the finished product. This is just draft one, but really it's setting the stage for a much more comprehensive kind of AI global, good or bad. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but in some sense that's where it's moving towards. I don't know. Do you agree with that? Does that, um, yeah,
I so the thing that I'm familiar with that kind of has explored this is a guy named Benjamin Bratton. Is that who you're referring to with
exactly.
the
Yes. It's
planetary? Okay.
based on Benjamin Bratton's work. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of his. He's, in my opinion, one of the few kind of like philosophers of technology that are actually doing philosophy of technology, and kind of
Hmm.
thinking in new ways that it's demanding. That's not to say that I agree with everything that he's coming out with, but I
Hmm.
don't know that he is suggesting that there's this kind of like unavoidable projection in terms of like this planetary scale at the level of like governance or control, right? I think like
Yeah.
the way I kind of corresponded to this notion of dimensionality in terms of like um, so so much of our reality now contains such higher dimensionality than all of the frameworks that we currently have to process it, to effectively model it, to properly integrate it, right? And what
Hmm.
the digital is doing, what all these technologies are doing, is it's exposing, it's dramatically expanding the dimensionality that we can play with, right? But we're all surrounded by frameworks, by institutions, by norms, by societies that are leaking dimensionality all over the place. They just can't model this effectively, right? So if we're thinking about like what you were just describing with Facebook was like we have all of this psychometric data, like this vast dimensionality that if we could compress that dimensionality, if we could take that and we could make it legible to our models to properly kind of like and officially integrate, like think of the things that we could do. Think if we had institutions that could take all that dimensionality and effectively model it. What that would be phenomenal, right? And I think like planetary sapience and planetary scale computation is similar to that, right? Like when we're talking about like having this planetary agency, this capacity to have outsized effects on at the effect of the planet, to kind of properly wield this agency is going to demand being able to make all of this dimensionality legible, right? And we can only do that if we have kind of the surveillance, the sensors, these types of things. Like he goes on quite a bit about how this kind of like backlash against surveillance is almost going to put us back because we've kind of like now anchored it to this surveillance capitalism, this like surveillance can only be done for bad. But like surveillance also is how we get access to dimensionality. And it affords us more optionality to then properly compress and integrate that dimensionality into ways that we can then properly model our reality. What are we doing to the planet? What do we need to do to get to the planet back to homeostasis? Like, well, we got to model that, right? And how did we even figure out that climate change happened? Right? Because of technology, right? Technology both
Yeah.
created and surfaced climate change. So like,
Yeah.
I think that's what he's going with there. And I think like you can, and I think Braddock makes the point as well. Like, I mean, there's models, like you can separate that from governance, right? Like you could say like and I'm sure many people do, like you can tell the story that, well, this is leading to, you know, one world government and this type of thing. But
Mhm.
I think that's again, like, you're not doing like you're not thinking that hard enough because like sure in its worst case scenario like that could certainly happen, but it's not determined. There's a million different ways that can happen. There's a million technological models that we can start to play with and explore and consider by which that wouldn't happen. And like I would argue that we have to do that, that those are required, and that the work of that has to be done now so as to prevent something like this kind of global planetary, you know, one world, one government system. Like there's a difference between planetary government and planetary governance, right?
Mhm.
One planetary government, you think of this kind of like very top down and authoritarian and you know one world government to rule everyone. But planetary governance happens in today's world with all sorts of different mechanisms. There's a huge dimensional space of possibilities for planetary governance, and a lot of those are opened up by technology, right? So this all has to happen together. Like we're not at the point right now where we can just like throw technologies and then we'll figure out later. Like we need to proactively think about what are the infrastructures, what are the governance models by which we can start to engage with this planetary governance. Because otherwise, like the scale of it is such that the error becomes so pronounced and so profound that there's not going to be room left for many more trials.
Yeah. And yeah, I don't know if I said one world government in a sense of, because it wouldn't necessarily have to be a government, I suppose. It's just you've
Right.
created this kind of distributed system that isn't working on national lines anymore, and that would be coordinated potentially by some kind of independent artificial agency or something that's been programmed. And I mean, Zach's kind of ambivalent about that in terms of like AI tutor kind of thing. I mean, you could have, because we talk about the psychographic data and all of that, like if you could be, it's literally personalized education in some sense of being like, here's a model of your dimensionality or your modeling. Here's, you know, where the end of your model is. You need to go and do these things in order to advance, to learn really. So it could be a very positive, I mean, profoundly. He talks about it as turning the whole world into a temple, like that this was almost like a sacred thing, really, if we could treat it properly. But obviously, the immense risk of that is that we blow ourselves up or drive ourselves insane in the process. So it does seem to be that significant, like on the cusp of heaven or
Yeah,
hell.
I'd like to understand that world as a temporal metaphor more, because like this very
Mm.
much gets to something of interest to me in terms of, what is the thing by which technology is in service of, right? And traditionally that has been some kind of religion, some kind of philosophy. Like what is the thing that is bigger than technology, that operates independently and autonomously outside of technology, by which that thing can then say this technology is good or bad, and this is how we should make this technology better, right? And it sounds like when you're kind of like casting this global planetary scale technology as something that could be perceived or conceptualized as a temple, like you're starting to put that into a mythical form that is kind of like
Yeah.
suggesting this broader perspective that is something bigger than technology itself. And I think that's super interesting, and I'm concerned that to do work at this scale, something like that would be required. Um, and Jonas gets into this a little bit. Like we criticize China because like, oh, they're if they have this amount of top-down control, nothing good can come from it. Um, but the flip side of that argument, where I would push back, would be only China has the capacity to say that we are going to make the claim that our children playing 10 hours of video games a day is not a good, right? This is
Yeah.
not the definition of the good. And we are going to make practical implementations to prevent that from happening, right? Like that's something that's just inconceivable in a Western democracy. That's just out, that's
Yeah.
beyond the possibility space of what a Western democracy. So if technology is getting at the global scale where something like that is necessary, where at some point a good has to be declared, and at some point practices need to be implemented in service of that good, it's interesting to kind of look at that model, not again to say China's good or bad, but just to understand exactly what's happening here and what might be required to be able to do some of this planetary governance at the scale of the technologies that we are looking at.
Yeah, and that it's kind of two sacred cows, really, in the West, in some sense of like the individual freedom, but then also the innovation, like the innovations creating this environment that we're all going to inhabit. That's really because, like, the digital world, it's based on like this, liberalism, freedom, information for everybody, but it really constrains our lives as well. Like, it does, you have to be subscribing to certain things to participate in it. And so, as we expand the technology, it hits the philosophical questions anyway. I think as the technology becomes our environment, the environment shapes who we are. We have to specify what the environment is, so we have to specify who we should be. Like the ethical questions are unavoidable, and if we don't address them, what is already happening is going to continue happening, which is that the companies just decide by default whatever suits them is going to be the end goal, the good. Um, and I think the Chinese model, as authoritarian as it is, they can do that, and we can't, and that's why we've struggled to deal with the problem more than they have.
Right. I mean, the question is, what is going to have the authority to make those kind of
Yeah,
declarations that you were just describing, right? Because
I
like the
mean,
classic criticism of liberalism is that it's kind of agnostic on what the good is, and where it wants to enable is the pursuit of good, right? Like it's
yeah,
less interested in defining what the good is, it's more interested in enabling the pursuit of that good for all, right? And that's obviously led to many positives, right? So like no one's going to criticize it on those terms, but at some point, like when a good has to be declared, because you can no longer make agnostic decisions on, say, whether bioengineering is something that is a good or not, right? Geoengineering, AI, all these things, right? Like these are going to demand definitions of the good, and then practical implementations to enforce those definitions of the good. And yeah, that's an open question for me. Is that a process by which the West can engage with? And if not, then what?
Yeah. And I mean, like that, what a difficult question, especially the like gene editing and question of like, you know, that level of control. I mean, I agree. I don't think we should have it, but you know, if that's the way it's going, how do you, you know, what is the good that you're selecting for in some sense? And I think with digital technologies, when we immerse ourselves in them, we're modifying our perceptions, we're modifying our priors in active inference language. Like, there's no way of avoiding that in some sense. So we can either, you know, try and get it right, or we can just leave it on autopilot, and which doesn't really work. But again, as you pointed out, it's pretty early doors in terms of this just starting. So the cool thing is it's bringing up these philosophical questions and making them relevant in like a real pressing way. Whereas before we could avoid them and be like, no, it doesn't, you know, the good can be whatever. It doesn't, you know, it's fine. But now it's like, oh yeah, this is like an existential threat really, that we have to do it. And so I'm working at the moment. I mean, it might be something interesting. I know we're a little bit over time here, but um, that's something I've been working on because I think we need a universal ethics. So I've been looking at the active inference framework account of well-being as a eudaimonic ethic, essentially. So what Plato does in the Republic is Plato was dealing with the problem of moral relativism in ancient Greece from the Ionian Revolution, or the Ionian Enlightenment, and then also the kind of Homeric mythology of the warrior king that he was trying to get past. Um, and so he grounds his virtue ethics in a structure of the psyche, the tripartite self. And I think the generative model in active inference is very similar to that, in a sense of that you have this leveled control structure, where the higher levels are supposed to control the lower levels. And so I'm arguing essentially we can have a kind of universal virtue ethic based in that, that can be, it gets over the charge of cultural relativism because you're saying it's rooted in a universal account of human nature, which the active inference isn't. There's culturally relative aspects to it, but it's a universal account pretty much. So you'd have that kind of minimum viable character basically to preserve that would then have to be programmed. And active inference is computational, so that I think that's a disadvantage in terms of describing the full nature of a person. I don't think we're fully computational, but it's an advantage in terms of it means it can be programmed, because it's, you know, anything that's going to be programmed digitally has to be well defined. It has to be mathematical. It can't be, you know, which means we're never going to fully fit into it as well. I think there is, you know, we're non-computational beings essentially. But yeah, I wonder maybe to get your thoughts on that a little bit. Do you think it's insanity, or is there anything worth
Yeah.
pursuing there?
I mean, I think there's absolutely something worth pursuing. But like with all these kind of like trying to look to nature, look to life, look to active inference, these types of things. Um, it's just obviously something that has to be done so carefully, because I think there's traditionally been, um, and Zach gets into this with his other book about, cosmic erotic virtues, right? Where he's saying like this notion of value, right, is something that is kind of inherent in the universe itself, in the cosmos, and kind of
Yeah.
where we've gotten away from it is assuming that it's eternal, right? That like whatever it was decreed by the Greeks or by Christ
Yeah.
or by any of these other kind of axiomatic figures, like that should be frozen in time, and those values are eternal. And what he's trying to argue is that no, the difference here is that they're also evolving. They're changing just like everything else. In that
Yes.
as
And
we evolve, value
mhm.
evolves. And so like I think there's interesting kind of lenses to kind of like uh, get beyond this kind of like naive naturalism, this kind of like naive natural law kind of like that have kind of taken on traditional criticisms, but then haven't really been reconsidered in light of all the new science, all the new reality, all the new dimensionality that we currently have to consider those things. So I think kind of exploring these, like even just in my own in exploring them, if nothing else, they've been tremendously generative in just kind of like opening up the possibility space for me to consider the ethical domain of technology, right? And whether like active inference like proves to be something resilient to all the ethical challenges of humanity, like I think that would be the open question that I would absolutely encourage you to explore, and I would love to see your work in progress on that. Um,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think the interesting thing there is like this notion of, prediction and surprise, because I think like a lot of where I value the human is, our a notion, our capacity to be suboptimal, our capacity to
Mhm.
be like, yeah, I'm going to be irrational because I have the capacity to be irrational, and if I want to be irrational, I'm going to be irrational, and like I'm going to do something completely novel. I'm going to do something the that my generative model cannot account for, right? Like I'm
The
going to
unknown.
defy, yeah, I'm going to defy optimization, right? I'm going to defy computation. I'm going to defy the algorithm. And this is the essence of human freedom, right? So
Yeah.
I actually haven't thought about it. This is me kind of thinking out loud, but like it'd be interesting to kind of phrase that dynamic, in within active inference, in terms of like I'm now in novel settings, right? And what does that mean for me in terms of now like the script no longer applies, right? So what does that mean, kind of from an ethical perspective, in terms of how active inference is kind of like enabling you to navigate those types of spaces.
Yeah. Well, that for me, I mean, I'm totally in agreement with that. I think we live in complex environments that aren't complicated, so we can't just algorithm our way out of it. Like, there's not just going to be a set of top down rules and processes that you can just have that are universally applicable in a kind of natural law sense, like a physics.
Hmm.
Um, but then again, I also don't think values are entirely relative. I think value is an objective structure that it's like an affordance. It's a relationship between the subject object that's transjective properly. And
Hmm.
so the reason for selecting virtue ethics is because it's context dependent and it's to do with development. So it's almost like you're putting in a developmental, it's like Vervaeke says that his relevance realization is the same as precision weighting of prediction error in active inference. So he has a paper integrating the two of them, and for him, relevance realization isn't solvable top down. You can't have a decree of something that's
Right.
perennially relevant, but you can get better at realizing relevance. So you can get good at discerning between things that are relevant and irrelevant in quicker times. And so I think that would be the kind of norm that you'd have, in a sense of this technology should foster our ability to separate signal from noise rather than bullshitting us. Like, there's a capacity there that can be grown, or the capacity that can be normative, rather than saying that, here are all of the laws that have to be followed in all time. Because I just think that that's not the reality we're in. So that's why I'm thinking about the active inference and kind of virtue ethics, because um, it's to do with the realization of relevance rather than just a relevance menu that you just enforce. Um,
Right. Yeah, no, I love that. And like I think like, this also plays into technology, because like so much of the difficulty of relevance and realization in a complex environment is combinatorial explosion, right? And so like all of the heuristics and kind of gut instincts and all these types of things that the human brain has developed has been to kind of to optimize, to compress dimensionality into legible forms by which we can make quick decisions that are energy efficient, right? And so the more that technology can do that, the more that technology can kind of both expose the dimensionality in our complex environments, but then also compress so that we can integrate it into our models without pretending like we need some kind of like AI to do all this hard work for us, right?
yeah.
Then we are going to improve in our capacity to realize relevance. So like I'm totally down with this approach, and I think it ties into a lot of what we've been talking about here.
Awesome. Well, that's I really appreciate you I all this, Brandon. To be honest, it's really amazing to get to share it with somebody, because this is all pulling together a lot of stuff here. And yeah, it's very exciting. So I hope you have another chat soon. I think we should
I'd be happy
keep
to,
discussing.
especially I'd love to, like, if you have any work on your kind of, your project here, like, send it my way. I'd love to read it.
Yeah, yeah, it's ongoing at the moment. Anyway, I'm still
I'm sure.
still in the early days, but
PhD, so I'll touch base in like 7 years. Is that the typical time frame?
Yeah, it'll be 2026 probably if they let me go.
Hopefully,
But thank you so
hopefully we
much,
won't have
Brandon. And
a world government by then.
yeah, the universal AI super
Right.
god. And I'll include the link to Tech for Life as well. I encourage people to check that out.
Yeah, that'd
100%.
be great.
Awesome work.
Awesome. Well, I had a great time. Love to do it again.